To be a scientist. Do you know what it's like to be a scientist? I'm asking you and telling you these things because these are things you would otherwise have to ask and tell yourself in the years and decades to come. My books on science sold well, but I didn't know until recently what it means to be a scientist. It means the opposite of what people believe it to mean. We don't extend the senses to probe, microbe, and universe. We deny the senses. We deny the evidence of our senses. A lifetime of such denial is what sends people into larva-eating rages. Noam, you want to TLDR that for us real quick?
Okay, well, sometimes science is more art than science, Morty. A lot of people don't get that.
I can't remember which American writer it was. I heard him speak and he said that his job is to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable.
Welcome to Books You Haven't Read. My name is Nate Rankin, and my mini-year in DeLillo continues. If you're just catching up, one of my reading goals this year is to complete the entire novels of Don DeLillo. I had 4 to go at the beginning of the year. I've read Libra, which you can watch the review on that, and I have now read RATNER'S Star. I still have the names in Underworld to go. So RATNER'S Star concerns the protagonist, Billy Twillig, who is a 14-year-old math prodigy, and he has just won the Nobel Prize in Mathematics. Billy is flown via several airplanes to a research station called Field Experiment 1, and there's like this massive telescopic array. You can think of it like SETI, if you know what that is. And this SETI-like telescopic array has just detected this message coming from RATNER'S Star. It's a series of radio pulses, and so they bring in the 14-year-old math genius to crack the code. The book is divided into 2 parts. The first part is about 300 pages, and that's called Adventures. The second part is roughly 150 pages, and that's called Reflections. It should be noted that Don DeLillo himself, in an interview with Tom Leclair, says that a lot of the elements within this book were sort of inspired by or based on Alice in Wonderland, and there's a really strong kind of Wonderland feel like to this whole book. And a lot of the characters have a kind of madness to their intellect or morality, or both, really. In fact, it kind of reminds me of, hey Noam, what's that thing you say about morality?
There's no more morality in world affairs fundamentally than there was in the time of Genghis Khan. They're just different factors to be concerned with.
Exactly. Madness exists alongside genius kind of indiscriminately throughout this novel. This is best displayed through this series of really crazy characters. You've got a man who's obsessed with spelunking for bat guano, a Honduran-German cartel that trades in said bat guano and also wants to hook Billy's brain up to a supercomputer so that they can manipulate financial transactions and currencies, I guess. An astrophysicist turned mystic, a Jesuit that studies the patterns of ant secretions, a self-described kingpin of alternate physics named Orang Mohol, who has an amphetamine habit. Now, I know what you're thinking. Don't worry. Yes, he offers drugs to the child. He is not greedy with his greenies. There's also the previous codebreaker, who now lives inside a hole inside of a hole in the ground. 2 holes. Oh, and a child-sized man that has a journalist for a sex slave. The way DeLillo kind of sends up this 1970s scientific intelligentsia really reminded me of kind of a similar way that Umberto Eco does it with more, like say medieval or Renaissance characters. One of the things that I'll get to later in this review is this theme or this idea of unknowability or incompleteness. And DeLillo presages this kind of theme with these almost grotesque caricatures of intelligentsia, so that there's this really weird syncretic mix of kind of folk wisdom mixed with traditional mathematics and science, mixed with various sort of mysticisms and Kabbalah and maybe a touch of Taoism or something in there. The whole point of this, of course, is to try and present that any class of intellectuals throughout any time in history is going to have necessary gaps in their knowledge. And what they fill it in with is this kind of Wonderland-esque logic, to great comic effect, I would say. I should talk about the style and language of this book. Keeping in mind that I haven't read Underworld, This is, of the DeLillo novels that I've read, easily his sort of densest and most prosaic prose. Honestly, it approaches like Cormac McCarthy levels of, impressiveness of prose. If you are into that, this is DeLillo at his sentence-by-sentence best. There is a fair amount of mathematical language throughout this book, but I would say that it's more conceptual than it is technical. If you have, let's say, a high school level understanding of math, I think you'll be okay. Case in point for this kind of conceptual versus technical. Billy won his Nobel Prize for something called Zorgs, Z-O-R-G-S. And Zorgs are never defined precisely in this book. In fact, when a character asks Billy to define them, Billy essentially says, well, I can't really do it in a non-technical way, and only 3 or 4 people in the world understand it anyway. Kind of a convenient way for DeLillo to get out of explaining it, of course. But it's also a reader-friendly way. I think DeLillo really treats the reader well, at least in terms of kind of science and mathematical concepts. And here I want to talk about the concept of heteroglossia. Heteroglossia is a term that I just learned after reading of this book. DeLillo uses it in his Tom Leclair interview, but it's also used and expanded upon to great effect in this paper that I found online on RATNER'S, link in the doobly-doo. Heteroglossia literally means varied speechiness, and that kind of comes up in 2 major ways in this novel. The first is through a series of flashbacks to Billy's childhood in the Bronx. And there's a lot of different ways that characters in those flashbacks speak. And this could be the broken English of, like, say, some immigrants that he lives around. Could be the very wisecracking, pop culture savvy way in which his parents, particularly his mother, speaks. To the strangest version is the screaming woman. And this is a woman whose screams he hears through the vents of, I guess, like an adjacent apartment. And eventually he meets this woman, and her way of writing, her idiolect, is written on the walls, and it's almost like borderline Arno Schmidt style kind of writing. It's very goofy and totally unique. All of this is to say that it's because of Billy's exposure to these different idiolects and these different glossias, you might say, that sort of generate his mathematical intuition, his intuition to pick out patterns. The second way in which heteroglossia kind of comes to terms in this book is that part 1 of the novel, when he's still above ground and he's having these series of adventures with all of these different scientists, all these different scientists themselves speak in a kind of unique vocabulary and speak in a really distinct and memorable way. And so that's all very generative and helpful for Billy in his sort of problem-solving brain. So let's circle back to that kind of incompleteness theme that I mentioned earlier. I don't think that the mathematician Kurt Gödel is ever name-checked in this book, but his ideas are all over it. Really quickly, I'll try and sum up what the incompleteness theorems are, but please keep in mind, I am an idiot that doesn't know what he's talking about. So there are basically 2 theorems that are part of Gödel's incompleteness theorems. The first one says that within any system of mathematics or arithmetic, there will be statements that are neither provably true or provably false. You just don't know. The second theorem of this is that as a consequence of the first theorem, no formal system can demonstrate its own consistency with the rules of that system. It needs rules kind of outside of it, or else it needs to be axiomatically assumed. In essence, the only way to prove the system is true is to assume that the system is true. Little circular there. Essentially, you can think of it as like a universal speed limit for certainty. A helpful analog might be the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And if you don't know what that is, that's, the idea in quantum mechanics that you can't know both with precision both the speed and position of a particular particle, and in fact, those two measurements are mutually exclusive, so if you know one really precisely, you don't know the other one at all, and vice versa. TLDR, incompleteness is the shape of the universe. And all of this is important because the essential gambit of the book is that characters are trying to penetrate through this veneer of unknowability. This is made most manifest in the novel's second part, when Robert Hopper Softly, the White Rabbit character, takes Billy down through underground to what's called the Antrum. Those two and three other characters, so 5 total, are working to develop something called Logicon, which is an attempt at making a transgalactic language so that they can communicate with the RATNER'Ians. Logicon is, in essence, really a reverse Tower of Babel, both in the sense that it's underground and they're burrowing, but also in the sense that they are trying to directly defy the word of God. God-ol.
Not funny!
Shut up, you're not my real dad. It should be noted that throughout the first part of the novel, the question of whether there actually are inhabitants within the RATNER'S star or whether the message itself is coming from that star system is thrown into complete doubt. But Softly wants to pursue Logicon almost as like a pure exercise in logic itself. Meanwhile, remember that bat guano-obsessed spelunker I talked about earlier in the video? Well, amidst his literal batshit spelunking activities, he comes across some archaeological remains in the caves that surrounds Field Experiment 1. What he finds is that as he goes further back in time, I should also mention this is where I'll get into spoilers. What he finds is that as he goes back further in time, the archaeological remains are getting more sophisticated and more complex, suggesting that a more advanced society existed in the farther back reaches of time. As well, Billy is really intellectually stunted once he's taken out of that heteroglossia of the above ground. So at one point, he goes back upstairs and goes to the previous codebreaker's old room. Remember that guy that lives in a hole in the ground? So he goes back to his old room, and he has this eureka moment, and he figures out that the transmission is essentially a timestamp. And so he comes, to this realization that, okay, at this time, it's like 2 o'clock something. Something is going to happen, but he's not sure what's going to happen, but he knows that something's going to happen. What's further is that message is deduced not to actually be coming from RATNER'S star, but to be coming from the Earth itself from like 1 million years ago. And this is where we find out that the Earth exists inside of a mohole totality, which is kind of a spin on black holes. It's named after that guy Mohole I mentioned at the top of the video. And this is what's known as a value dark dimension. Basically, it's an indescribable, completely unknowable dimension of space. Well, Earth is within one of these dimensions, and that message got out, 1 million years ago, and is now boomeranging back. Boomerangs are a big theme in this book, a consistent image. It boomerangs back now, and it's gotten to them, and so it's making a prediction about something that's going to happen. And the event that happens, pause for a moment of suspense, is an eclipse. It's an unscheduled eclipse that no scientist in the world has ever been able to predict. And there's this really gorgeous writing of the moments of the eclipse, and there's this depiction of, all these things are breaking down. The sense of the world itself is breaking down to the point that Softly observes that when the eclipse happens, the place where he is in the world, which I believe should be Russia or China, depending on context clues, that place in the world, it should be night, but in fact it's day, and he's trying to get underground before the eclipse hits him. The ending of this novel is probably my favorite part of the novel. Interesting fact, if you've ever read White Noise, this book, the last scene, also involves a kid on a trike. What's that supposed to mean? RATNER'S star I gave a full 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. Might honestly be another favorite. I wish I hadn't waited so long to read this particular DeLillo. I wouldn't start with it if you're new to DeLillo. Read a couple other things like, White Noise, Libra, End Zone's a really good one to start with. But this one's a really rewarding one, and I would say do not put it off like I did. Thanks for watching. I'm going to switch up the outro today. I am going to leave you with the dulcet tones of one Avram Noam Chomsky. Professor, take us away.
Now, a federated, decentralized system of free associations incorporating economic as well as social institutions would be what I refer to as anarcho-syndicalism, and it seems to me that it is the appropriate form of social organization for an advanced technological society in which human beings do not have to be forced into the position of tools, of cogs in the machine.
On the other hand, suppose you say something that just isn't regurgitating conventional piety. Suppose you say, the biggest international terror operations that are known are the ones that are run out of Washington. Education is a system of imposed ignorance. What happened in the 1980s is the U.S. government was driven underground.
The best political leaders are the ones who are lazy and corrupt.
If the Nuremberg laws were applied, then every post-war American president would have been hanged.